I'd like to preface this story by acknowledging that the truthfulness or reliability of asylum or escape mental patient stories tends to be questionable. The reason why I am skeptical of those stories is that large-scale closures of asylums began in 1967 through the 1980s and were completely decommissioned by 2015. So I raise my eyebrow whenever someone talks about spooky asylum stories that happened within the last 2 decades or so. Still, I will be sharing my story as factually as my memory will allow me to, and will refrain from exaggerating any aspect. I often visited my grandparents' home in Traverse City in northern Michigan during the summers with my parents. Traverse City, TC is a beautiful place. It produces 75% of the world's cherries, and was home to the Traverse City Regional Psychiatric Hospital, which operated from 1885 to 1989. Since the United States federal government officially deemed the hospital worthy of preservation for its historic significance, the building on the hospital grounds were guarded by patrolling security guards. The TC Psychiatric Hospital was massive, including 70 or 80 buildings of various sizes. Some buildings have now been converted into restaurants, gift shops, tourism traps, cafes, etc. But many remain empty and abandoned. Underneath the hospital is a sprawling brick tunnel system, which the hospital staff used to safely transport the patients from building to building in the frigid winter temperatures. I'm sure there are instances where the patients underwent cruel treatments or were subject to the care of horrible doctors, but the TC Psychiatric Hospital had a great reputation. Many teenagers, including myself at the time, were unshamingly fascinated with the hospital and its history. As a result, we would often break into abandoned buildings through unbarred windows or doors with pickable padlocks. While there were a few cases where teens would get caught and charged with breaking and entering, as long as we were stealthy, stuck to our safe entrances, and paid attention to the guards' patrol patterns, we could go in and out without worry. I'm not advocating for this or trying to justify any criminal activity, but breaking into the old hospital was almost a rite of passage for the TC teens. The hospital's interior was terrifying. There was old, stained, and broken equipment and furniture, crumbling floors and walls, vandalism, strange old building noises, and complete and utter darkness in the tunnels, basements, and lower floors. Using flashlights was too risky with the guards patrolling, so we often navigated the hospital by memory and our dimly lit phone screens. As you can imagine, our frightening youthful imaginations ran wild with horror stories, which is pretty much ironic considering we made up most of those stories. Unfortunately, during my last trip inside, I encountered something that terrified me to the point I swore off ever returning. The story takes place around 10 p.m. Moonlight was dim, and most patrol guards left for the day. Clad in black, my friend Jason and I entered through the same window we always used, and followed our regular path to one of the tall, jutting spires to sit by the window that overlooked the entire city. There was only one thing different about this venture from all the others. A new faint and unexplainable smoky odor. Not smoky like fire, but something more akin to incense. The smell was so faint we almost thought we were imagining it, but it grew stronger as we got closer to our destination. Rather than taking the stairs that led up the spire, we followed the smell down a different hallway until we reached a room with a deep red glow emanating from the doorway. Rather than doing the smart thing by leaving immediately, we couldn't resist the urge to walk closer and investigate. When we finally reached the room, I audibly gasped and felt Jason grab my wrist so hard his nails left marks in my skin. We found a large ring of red votive candles and burning incense circling a drawing of a pentagram with a sigil of Baphomet. In the center of the drawing was a dead-blooded bird surrounded by black feathers. Bear in mind that I was raised devoutly Catholic, so seeing this image filled me with a sense of fear stronger and more paralyzing than any ghost sighting ever could. Later on that night, Jason told me I immediately started mumbling prayers, but I personally don't remember doing that. I wouldn't be terribly surprised though. While the duration felt infinite, I'm not sure how long we stared at the occult scene before hearing a man's low and ominous voice behind us saying, "Welcome, friends." I promise you that there was absolutely nothing friendly about the way the guy greeted us. Jason and I screamed, "Killer," and whipped around and saw two nicely dressed but frazzled-looking adult men staring at us. The man in front of me held something in his hand, and while I can't say for sure what it was, I remember thinking it was a knife at the time, which wouldn't be so crazy of a guess considering they recently sacrificed a bird. Jason and I then sprinted past the two. I felt someone's fingers grab the back of my shirt. Thankfully, the occultist's hand didn't have a solid hold on me because I ducked and managed to escape his grip. The men shouted for us to stop running. We obviously didn't. We heard their footsteps chasing after us for a little while, but thankfully, Jason and I had broken into the hospital so many times that running through the unlit rooms, hallways, and tunnels was no challenge. But when we finally reached and vaulted through our escape window, the occultists were nowhere to be seen or heard. We kept running through the hospital grounds until we reached Jason's car, with no concern for the patrol guards. We would have rather gotten caught by the guards than the occultists. I puked twice in the parking lot, whether because of fear, sprinting nonstop for a mile and a half, or a combination of the two. But I'm not sure what would have happened if the occultists caught us. But I know one thing for certain: they weren't going to crack open a beer and sing Kumbaya by the candlelight. I'm not familiar with occultic practices or satanic rituals, so I'm not sure if those men were trying to do something, or if they were summoning something of such. Jason and I never returned to the hospital during that summer, or any of the following summers. While we aren't close now that we're adults, I know that horrifying experience will keep us cemented in each other's memories until we're gone. In my mid-20s, I worked at my local hospital as a CNA on the psych floor, and to be honest, I really enjoyed my job. It was different than any other floor at the hospital, and we always had unique patients, so work was never dull. However, there was one night that scared the absolute crap out of me so bad that I never wanted to work on that floor ever again. On this particular night, I was on call, and usually this meant I was going to end up being a float sitter, either for the ER or for another floor. Lucky for me, I was indeed going to be a sitter in the ER. After clocking in and taking any sharp objects out of my pockets, my favorite nurse was working with me, so I knew it wasn't going to be a bad night. He pulled me aside to give me a report and gave me a worried look, before he asked me in a light whisper, "Hey, you don't scare easily, do you?" I side-eyed him before saying, "You're kidding, right? You remember my first day here, where my patient ripped out his IV with his teeth and sprayed my PPEs with his blood? Or that one guy who proposed to me and said, 'Would you marry me?' in hell by Satan himself. So no, I don't scare easily." Well, you might change your mind after you see her. I peeked behind the curtain, and laying on the bed was a middle-aged woman with a bloody rag wrapped tightly around her forearm. Her eyes were darting back and forth, and hushed mumbles were coming from the corner of her mouth. Great, I thought to myself. Another junkie detox case that I have to deal with. Before I walked in to start running her vitals, the nurse said that the wound specialist will be in shortly. I nodded and put on my best smile. While putting on the blood pressure cuff to her opposite arm, I asked her how she got hurt. I kid you not, this lady, who I'll call Sheila to avoid some kind of HIPAA violation situation, looked at me and snorted and laughed and said, "None of your business, sweetheart." I knew she was going to be a difficult case and wasn't in the right frame of mind. However, I tried to make the best out of the situation and said that she was going to be stuck with me until the morning, and she could talk whenever she was ready. She liked the idea of that, and the longer I sat with her, the more comfortable she became, as she spouted out her life story. She was a drug addict who was trying to quit. She wasn't sure why she was here. It said that her sister would be coming to take her home, as she always did. Suddenly, there was a knock on the door, and the wound specialist came in to evaluate her arm. Sheila was reluctant at first, but I assured her the sooner she could show us her arm, the sooner she could go home and sleep off her high. Sheila took the bloody rag off, and I thought the wound specialist was going to hit the floor as her face turned a shade of green I've only ever seen before in cartoons. Then my own jaw dropped to the floor, and I could feel bile racing in my throat. I managed to choke out, Sheila, what happened to you?" She gave me the creepiest smile I've ever seen and said in a low whisper, "I wanted to see what my skeleton looked like." Turns out she had some kind of crazy drug concoction for taking a freaking vegetable peeler to her arm. The wound specialist got all the documentation that she needed, and without saying a single word, she fast walked out of the door, leaving me to continue sitting with Sheila. Her sister showed up an hour later after we got Sheila into a blanket-wrapped bed, in case she were to start seizing from all the effects of the drugs. Thank God the morning wasn't too far off, and I couldn't leave the hospital fast enough. I remember sitting in the parking lot for the longest time and cried hard into my steering wheel. My nerves were shot, and I just had enough. This case absolutely made me reconsider staying in the medical field, and I left the hospital shortly after. I still can't eat certain meat dishes to this day, because I always think of Sheila and wanting to see her own skeleton. For a little bit of backstory, a few years ago I got my tonsils removed, and I should mention that I am well into my 30s. I thought it would be a fairly simple recovery given that every time I've ever heard about someone getting their tonsils removed, that someone was a child. Blending what I had learned from television, my friends, the internet, it seemed like it would be a breeze. I'd just be living off ice cream and mashed potatoes, watch a lot of Netflix, and sleep. Spoiler alert, it was far from a breeze. I found myself in an emergency room at 3 a.m, 7 days after my surgery, with blood in my throat and the worst pain I could ever imagine. It was a really bad night. But what made that night just a little bit worse was the fact that I was all alone. But I was being really tough about the whole thing. After I'd been triaged and admitted to a room, I tried to make myself comfortable and turn on the TV. The room was fairly large for an ER room. I searched through the channels and found something I wanted to watch, and decided to text my boss to let him know I probably wouldn't be in the next day. I dug for my phone in my purse, found it, and when I looked up, I realized there was a man in my room. I knew immediately that this man was not in his right of mind. He was youngish, wearing a dirty t-shirt and khaki shorts, and stared at me, unblinking. "Hi, can I help you?" I asked. The man continued staring at me and said nothing. I don't think you're supposed to be in here," I said, trying to be polite. He said nothing, but then began advancing towards my bed, slowly. My heart was racing, and I was thinking, leave it to me to be murdered in an emergency room. I don't remember what I said next, only that it was some version of, "You're not supposed to be in here. Please leave." But he kept on advancing. He was steps away from my bed when 3 cops rushed into the room. The 3 of them put their hands in front of them, defensively, but used very polite and soothing tones. They said things like, "Wrong room, buddy," and "Let's go this way." But they never touched him. Somehow, they were able to coax him out of the door and down the hall, closing the door behind them. It was surreal. I almost could have thought I would have imagined the whole thing, except a few minutes later, a doctor came in to see me and immediately addressed the situation and apologized for my surprise visitor. "Yeah, we have an office med situation," he said, as though that explained everything. Being in a hospital is truly where we are the most vulnerable, I realized. And I hadn't until then realized how completely mashed together and exposed we can truly be. Nothing happened, but it totally could have been in those minutes. We were alone together. Anything could have happened. Anyway, I live to see another day. But the guy in the hospital, I truly hope I never see you again.